Hey you guys, it's Peter, and welcome to my channel, Peter Watches TV, where I watch all the television shows, and then I come over here and I react to them. And today, I want to talk about American Murder, Gabby Petito, the new true crime documentary that just came out on Netflix a couple days ago. I was really excited and intrigued to watch this documentary, in part because this is not a case that I watched go down in real time very much. In all honesty, I didn't really catch this case until the FBI were involved, and Brian was hiding out at his parents' house and things like that. I didn't catch on to this case until much later than most people. In fact, a lot of my friends were watching it go down in real time. I can remember talking to a lot of my friends, and they would say things like, "Oh my God, did you hear about this?" And I can remember watching a couple videos on YouTube about it, and not even really, to be honest with you, understanding really what was going on, who she was, how she went missing. I didn't really understand it. And at that time, I remember there was just kind of like this media frenzy, which they discuss in the documentary. One of the things that I want to say before I get into this reaction to this documentary is that on this channel, specifically on this channel, on my Peter Mon channel, if I talk about true crime over there, I'm getting more into kind of like the meat and potatoes of the story behind the documentary, if that makes sense. But over here, unless I know a lot about a case, like tonight I will be watching the new Herb Baumeister Fox Hollow Farms documentary that's coming out on Hulu, and I'm actually making a video about that today on my Peter Mon channel, because that is a case that I have extensively followed for years. Unless it's a case that I know a lot about, over here, I am just reacting to the documentary. I'm a little nervous to make this video today because I know that whatever I say, people will say, well, they left this out, or they didn't, say this, or they didn't show that. And like I said, I don't really know a lot about this case other than what I watched in the documentary last night. And I'm just going to react to that. So feel free to educate myself or anybody else in the comment sections about discrepancies that you saw in the documentary, things that I might not have noticed because I don't have the background of this case like I'm sure many of you do. I actually started watching it last night. A friend of mine, she was at her house, I was at my house, we were like texting, watching it. She actually watched it pretty extensively, go down in real time, and when we started watching it, she watched the first episode and then she went to bed, and I asked her what she thought, and she said, it's really interesting because you're seeing a lot of background footage that she said I had never seen before. She was like, I watched the coverage on YouTube and on TikTok and people talking about it online. She said, I watched a lot of YouTubers talking about it. I watched the news coverage of it, but you didn't see a lot of, other than them getting pulled over. You didn't see a lot of like the text messaging that went back and forth between them. You didn't see a lot of that unless you watched like every video that was put out about it. So I went into this, I knew who Gabby Petito was. I knew that she was attempting to start a van life YouTube channel, but I didn't really, and I knew that, her fiance at the time, Brian Laundrie, was the one that had murdered her. And I knew that he had come back to Florida and then his parents were allegedly hiding him. And I knew that there was some other stuff involved with that. But other than that, I didn't really know a lot about the case. So this was really, really interesting for me to watch. And I have to say that I love when I go into a documentary, and I really, and honestly, it's one of my favorite things is going into a documentary that I don't know a lot about the case, because like tonight in watching the Fox Hollow Farms case, I'm going to be picking it apart. I'm going to be like, oh, they left this out, or they didn't say this, or why are they, whatever. So for me to go into a documentary where I don't really know much about it, the problem with that is there propaganda behind why this documentary is being made? And I'm not just specifically talking about this documentary, I'm talking about any documentary. In last year, we saw a Netflix documentary come out about the Laci Peterson, Scott Peterson case, right? And then I think it was like from her point of view and her family's point of view. And then like 3 days later, a documentary was released. I think it was called Face to Face, in Scott Peterson's words or something like that. And it was from Scott Peterson's point of view. So, for me growing up as a documentary lover, not just true crime, but documentaries in general, documentarians and directors and producers of documentaries are supposed to stay objective to the story and just report the true story of what's really going on. I think that's a prime example where the feeding out of the story, they were trying to tell it one way or the other, right? That they were trying to they were trying to, like, Face to Face was trying to show it specifically from Scott Peterson's point of view. And the Lacey Peterson story was showing it completely from Lacey Peterson's point of view. And instead of being completely objective to the story, which I always think it's interesting. I think that would be kind of a hard thing to do. Recently, when I covered the JonBenet Ramsey case, there were so many differing opinions in the comment section of my video of people that said, no, this is exactly what happened, or no, this is exactly what happened. That it's interesting that a case like that, there are still to this day, 30 years later, there are so many different opinions about it. I think in retrospect of watching that documentary and then reading the comments, I think that people were saying that the reason why JonBenet, John's dad, JonBenet Ramsey's father, was interviewed so highly was kind of like, this is his moment, to like finally give him his moment, his interview. And so maybe the motive behind that documentary was to shine light on what a great father John Ramsey had been. And a lot of people were like, well, if they took that angle and they didn't interview people across the board, then it's not really a fair documentary. And I think there's a lot of merit to that, honestly, in retrospect. So today I want to talk about the Gabby Petito case. And like I said, I went into it like not knowing a lot about this case. So the documentary is a 3-part series. I actually thought it was really, really well done. It did feel like they focused on some pieces longer than others, and then it kind of felt like it could have been a 4 or 5 part documentary. It felt pretty quick to me, if you want to know the truth. So the first part of the documentary is basically introducing us to Gabby Petito and who she was. And Gabby Petito was a 22-year-old young woman and was dating Brian Laundrie, and then, am I pronouncing his name right? Anyway, then got engaged, and he proposed to her with no ring, and then she wanted to start this like van life YouTube channel, and that was her dream and that was her goal. And so then they were going out west and staying in national parks and things like that, and she was filming the whole thing. And so there was a lot of friends that were interviewed as well. I mean, her mom and her stepdad, her dad and her stepmom were interviewed. Her ex-boyfriend, Jackson, was interviewed. Her close friend, I believe her name was Rose, was interviewed throughout the whole thing. One of Brian's friends that was also Gabby's friend, like, it was his high school friend. She was interviewed as well. Police officers, FBI agents were interviewed. I'm trying to think of who else was interviewed in this documentary. I mean, there were a lot of people that were interviewed to kind of give a conclusive story. What was interesting to me in watching the first episode, and like I said, I went into this not really knowing a lot about this case, is that it's the whole documentary. Like, when you start watching the documentary, I believe it's like in the trailer or like the beginning of the documentary, they show this part where Gabby and Brian are pulled over, and I believe it's in Utah, and they're pulled over, and this is footage that came out like after, Gabby was found and they had an arrest warrant out for Brian. They show this footage of supposedly somebody called in the police and told them that they saw Gabby and Brian like arguing, and that Brian was slapping Gabby as he was driving down the road. And so they call in like a domestic violence kind of a DV kind of situation. And then when the police pull them over, it completely switches. And this is kind of, I think, the reason why they showed it maybe at the beginning and then they showed it later again in depth was really at the source of what was really going on here. And what it was really I think it was trying to show was how unprotected victims of DV are in our world today. And you see this scene where Gabby is very, very upset. They pull her out of the van. They ask him about what's happening. What's interesting to me about this scene is that they put her in the police van in the back, and they say to her, like, you have marks on your face, you have marks on your arm, but then they pull him out and they say, oh, you have scratches on your face. And all of a sudden, based on witness supposedly testimony and what they saw driving down the road, they paint her as the aggressor. I thought it was really, really interesting how this whole thing went down. Just watching it, having had friends of mine that are in situations like that, where in that moment, you do not know that the police are going to take you out of that situation and protect you for the rest of your life. I had friends of mine tell me how scary of a situation that is, and that you side with the abuser and things like that because you're terrified. You don't know that they're not going to pull away in 5 minutes and you're going to be left with this person that you've just said, yeah, he was beating the shit out of me, right? And so it's a really scary situation. When you watch that scene in there, and it kind of sets up the foreshadowing of what happened to Gabby Petito, it's eerie, and I had never seen that footage before, of this scared young woman that's terrified. And I think also what it shows is the stigmatization of victims in our society that feel on some level, and that is part of the abuse as well, that I think that if this documentary showed anything, and it showed how police officers, investigators need to be educated on abuse and DV, because that they are, sometimes the victims are the biggest excusers of the abusers. And this was a moment in time that had the police interceded and done what was right, that, and I was even sitting there thinking, like, if they really believed that she was the aggressor, if they had even arrested her in that situation, because they told them to spend the night apart, but later that night they met up. They put him in a hotel. Even if they had arrested her believing that she was the aggressor, I think that enough would have been like a wake-up call. Like, she would have contacted her parents, something would have happened that would have interceded, but the police really did nothing. They put him in a hotel room, and then the police, their attitude was basically like, you know, if they get back together later, that's on them, that's not on us, kind of thing. Well, I don't know, that kind of leaves a bad feeling for me, kind of like whatever happens to them happens to them. That's how they kind of start the show. So what it's about is, if you don't know anything about this case, it's about Gabby Petito and her fiance, Brian. And she starts this vlog channel of being, she only ever put one video out. They show this at the very end, that at the time that she passed away, she had like 500 or 700 views on it, and now it has like 7 million views on it. I didn't even look to see if there were more views on it. But anyway, so her dream was to start this like travel van life. So they buy this van and they turn it into like this RV kind of thing, and they're traveling, they're staying in, you know, whatever. And then I think it was like August 25th, August 27th, her mom stops hearing from her. And then there's like 10 days where mom doesn't hear from her, and she's contacting her. At one point, Gabby reaches out to her mom and says, will you have, like, her grandfather stop contacting us about something? But she refers to her grandfather as Stan, which her mom's like, oh, Brian must have been texting that, because she always called her grandfather Grandpa. And so she's missing for like 10 days, and they don't hear anything from her. They don't know anything about her. In those 10 days, Brian comes back to Florida, okay? And that's kind of what sets alarm bells off, is that they do, like, the parents live in Long Island, and so they call the police in Florida, because when they try to report it, they said that it has to be from the place of residence. So they contact the police in Florida. The police show up to Brian's parents' house. The parents at that point say they're not going to talk to the police, and that they have an attorney, okay? Which the police are like, well, why did you hire an attorney? Like, why are we, if this was your child and you were missing? What was interesting to me about this scene was that the Florida police didn't seem as concerned as the Long Island police did. Like, they were willing to work together, but they even said to the parents the second time around, isn't it strange, like, if this happened to your child, like, you would want to help us? But I don't know, it just seemed like everybody was kind of working against the case. I will say this, in the first episode of the documentary, they show a lot of scenes. I don't know why they did this, and I didn't love it, if you want to know the truth. They showed a lot of scenes of Brian and Gabby arguing that they had caught on, like, found footage that she had not included in the vlog, like leftover footage that she had on her camera. But in all honesty, the scenes did not make Gabby look great. I mean, she's like rolling her eyes. She's like, you can tell she's upset with Brian. But in those scenes, like, he isn't really challenging her a lot. I didn't really understand what the need was in including those scenes, okay? You have a young woman that's been murdered by her fiance, that was a victim of abuse. He has now taken his life. I don't understand what the need was to paint a victim in that light. And this is why this is important to me, okay? Because documentaries like this, when you have to remember who audience members are out there. If audience members are victims, if I picked up on it, I have to believe at least one or two other people picked up on it, okay? That victims of abuse out there, if they're watching this documentary and they think this is already how society portrays us, that we're the ones that are instigating it, or we're the ones that are doing that, I just didn't understand why it needed to be included, okay? I mean, if you record any couple over the course of 2 weeks, there's going to be eye rolls, there's going to be arguments. There's nothing about that warrants any kind of, that an argument is deserving or anything like that. I just didn't understand why they did it. It was confusing to me. And I'm saying it because I want to see if anybody else picked up on it, because they were trying to paint this picture that Brian was the one that instigated all this. But when you watch the documentary, especially with like the scene where they're talking about her being the aggressor, it's not even until like the second or the third episode, I think it's the third episode, when the footage is finally released to the media, that the mother was like, she was scared. She called me. She was not an aggressor, right? And so and then she called her boyfriend that night, her ex-boyfriend that, I mean, when you see all that and you piece it together, I just didn't understand why the first episode they needed to paint it that way. Even the friend of Brian, when they're interviewing her, I mean, I was kind of like, it's going to be interesting to see how she plays out in the third episode, because up until then, she talks about like Brian, like he's like the greatest guy in the face of the earth. And so I was like, and at the end, she turns and she says, she's like, no, she was like I didn't know who he was. Like, he was nobody that I knew who he was, and I feel so bad for her family and stuff like that. And I don't know, it felt weird to me that they almost kind of played into the myth, or into, I don't know. I just didn't love how they portrayed the whole situation in the first episode. So the first episode's about that. And then the second episode is really about her missing. And then the third episode is about them finding her remains in her body. And then, Brian's family, kind of like hiding him out and things like that. What was so interesting to me about this is, on the heels of, I just watched one of my favorite true crime documentary series that I just covered over here not too long ago. It's called Murder on the Friday Night Lights. And they just did an episode, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, about Tristan Bailey, who is the 12-year-old cheerleader that was murdered in Florida. In that documentary, what was so interesting to me, if you compare these cases a little bit, right, is that in that documentary, the mother of the murderer, the kid, I think he was 17 or 18 at the time, she goes home, she basically coaches him, okay, in the interview room at the police station, and says, no, you were wearing khakis, not jeans, because she knew he was wearing jeans and there was bloodstains on him. The reason that she knows that is because she goes home, she washes out the jeans, she puts them back in the laundry basket to cover up any bloodstains that were possibly there. The mother literally, okay, she intervened and came in the way of obstructing, justice and, messing with evidence and things like that. And she was arrested and did I thought it was minimal, but she did 30 days in jail, okay? But the laundry parents, or Brian Landry, whatever his name, Laundry, those parents, they like hid him out, got an attorney. They find out later that there's phone records that are showing that they were talking to him and that he told her that she was gone. So they knew weeks ahead of her own parents that she was gone. They protected him. They found this letter that the mom had written him that basically said, I'll hand you a shovel and I'll whatever, if you ever get in trouble. And then they basically help him escape to this park or whatever it's insinuated. And no charges are ever pressed against the parents. I don't understand. There's no charges pressed with obstructing justice. I don't know if it's because they obtained an attorney. I don't know why, but the hardest scene to watch was when the parents of Gabby find out that that Brian's parents have obtained an attorney. The hardest scene for that is because the mother is like, in that moment, she knows there's no reason why they would hire and put a $25,000 retainer. I mean, that is an expensive retainer. I mean, I think a $5,000 retainer for an attorney is expensive. $25,000 is astronomical. So what the father even says in there, to put down a retainer like that, an attorney, means it's going to be a heavy case, right? So those parents put down a $25,000 retainer knowing that their son had murdered Gabby Petito. His story was that she came out of the water and whatever, and then he put her out of her misery like she was an animal or something, and it just didn't click with anything that had been found at the site, any of the evidence or anything like that. So probably that's what he told his parents on the phone, and then they got the attorney because they thought, we got to help our kid and whatever, and believed it. But the fact that they were never willing to work with them, it's interesting. At one point, they show the sister and the brother-in-law come out of their house, and they're being interviewed by the press, and they're like, we're not talking to our parents and whatever. But while Gabby is missing, or while Brian is missing, they show text messages back and forth between the sister and the mother talking about how the police are saying that Brian went missing because they thought that his mother was her. And they're joking, and they're talking about how stupid the police force is, okay? Well, the sister had just come out and talked about how sad she was about this whole situation, that they had had lost a sister-in-law and all this kind of stuff. You're so sad that you're joking with your mom that the police aren't finding your brother, who is the murderer, and you knew that. Like, it's so disgusting to me that these people were not held accountable in any way, shape, or form, other than that Gabby's parents and step-parents sued in a civil case Brian's parents and for wrongful death suit, and apparently it was settled out of court. So I don't know how much was won in that suit. They didn't share it in the story. I don't know, the whole thing was just so sad to me. I think, I feel like I've watched a lot of cases recently where, it's like just watching the O.J. Simpson trial, the O.J. Simpson case the other day on Netflix, and at the end of it, Christopher Darden talks about how, at the end of the day, it's basically a domestic violence case. And that was really, I think, kind of a little bit what they were trying to show in there, is that this was really, at its end, a domestic violence case, and that if people that were trained to intercede had done their job, then maybe this wouldn't have been the case. It just was really, really sad. It was an absolutely sad story. At the end of it, it was interesting how they kind of threw this in there. They kind of threw this in there at, like, the very last moment. I didn't really understand why they did it and why they kept it so brief. But they showed news footage of, I think because, if I remember correctly at the time, this idea did get a lot of media traction. That the fact that Gabby Petito was a young white woman got media attention and people were looking for her overnight, right? And I actually mentioned this in the story talking about Tristan Bailey that was on Murder on the Friday Night Lights. My tripod fell. And I was talking about this with the case with Tristan Bailey on Murder on the Friday Night Lights, that she was this 12-year-old, white young female that, and it took to social media and just took off like nobody's business. And in that case as well, it was mentioned that, that young white women, that their stories are picked up by social media and becomes, overnight, like, people are really looking into it. Gabby's dad addresses this in the video, or in the documentary, and he says that at first he was really upset about hearing that. And I can totally understand that. I mean, to the father, to the parent, to a friend, to anybody around that situation, it's not just a young white woman. It's your daughter, it's your friend, it's your grandchild, it's your sister. I understand that. But in the grand scheme of things, and he says, but the more I looked into it, the more I found. I thought this was such an important piece that they put in there. And then later talking about domestic violence as well and tying it all together. The amount of cases of Black Latino women in our country that are victims of abuse and that are missing, people, Black men and women, Latino men and women, and especially Indigenous women, which they talk about. There was an entire show with Hilary Swank that was done that got canceled because of viewership, and it was fantastically done, called Alaska Daily. And it was like, the focus about it was missing and murdered Indigenous women in Alaska. And, these are just segments of society, marginalized communities that are just completely neglected and not looked at. And the reality is that people from Black, Latino, Indigenous communities go missing every single day, and they're not getting the kind of news coverage. I think the story behind that and why that needs to be mentioned in this documentary, okay, and what this one woman keeps on saying is, it doesn't take away from the story of Gabby Petito, and that is 100% true. None of that takes away from the importance, the value, or the story of Gabby Petito. She was a human being. She never deserved this. This is a horrible, horrible case that happened. I mean, for the family, obviously, for her, for everybody involved, it's so incredibly sad, that this is how it ended. But I think it is important to note that those people that go missing, whose stories are never heard, their stories are just as important. Their stories are important too. I think it was interesting that they added that in there at the very end, and then it ended with this, the parents doing this advocacy for victims of DV. At the very end, the whole family goes out there with the ex-boyfriend and the friend and everything, and they go visit the site of where Gabby was found, and then they spread the ashes and things like that. It just was, I have to be honest with you, true crime documentaries, it takes a lot to move me to emotion. At the end of it, especially with, like, her, I don't know, there was a scene with her mother, and I think it was a scene when they talked about the parents obtained the attorney, and the mom you could just see it in her face, and she starts crying. She's like, I knew in that moment, I mean, she knew in that moment, like, if they got an attorney like this, like, and I just was like bawling my eyes out. And then at the very end, there was a scene where they're talking to her father. The stepfather and the stepmother too. I think there were like some kind of some situations here that I don't know, that meant a lot to me watching the show, where you could see that the step-parents and the parents all worked together. The fact that the stepfather was the one that went out there and kind of was like representative of the family, with the police looking for Gabby in the Grand Teton, area and all that kind of stuff. That I thought was very moving. But there was a part at the very end when Gabby's father spoke, and I just lost it. For a true crime documentary to move me to emotion, like I said, it takes a lot. I think it really speaks to the humanity of the people. I think in watching any of these stories and covering, reading these books, any of these things, I think it's really, really important to pay homage to the victim, to pay homage to their life, and to pay homage to their story, not just what happened to them, so that they're forever remembered for the celebration of who they were. And I thought that this documentary did a really good job of doing that. So please let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. If you haven't watched it, I would highly recommend it. I thought it was very, very well done. One of the most moving parts for me was the FBI agent at the very end. And I think this might be how it ended, or right before they go out there to spread her ashes. And she talks about all the victims that are still out there, and that's why her job is important. It was very moving. There was a lot of really moving parts to this documentary for me, and I thought it was a really important, it surpassed, and they talk about this in here. The parents talked about how many people have reached out to them that have missing, children or missing loved ones that have reached out to the parents. I think what it does is it shows that Gabby's story, her life, extends past just what happened to her and maybe helping other people as well. Anyway, let me know what you thought in the comment section below. I love you guys, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.